Generation, fewer and fewer people believe that Genesis is literal history. And probably the most controversial story of all is Noah's Ark. Most people think that it's just basically legend or allegory, and that sadly includes a lot of Christians. Now, if you've been told all through school and the media and elsewhere that basically the earth and all life on it is billions of years old and there's no evidence to the contrary, then I get it. It makes sense. But that's not the case. And I believe that the best way for you to strengthen your faith and be able to better defend it is if you have or understand the external verification of the biblical account. Now, if you believe in the historical miracle of Jesus Christ, that he came to earth, died for our sins, and was risen again, but then had your question whether God could use supernatural events to have a worldwide flood, then we're not being very intellectually consistent. But as I said, if you don't have that other information, it makes it kind of tough. So I've done the heavy lifting. I've looked at resources such as these and compiled them, and I'm going to bring it to you. We are going to cover the historical and anthropological support of Noah's account. We're going to look at the feasibility of the ark in terms of function. We're going to cover the evidence from geology, biology, and paleontology that supports Noah's Ark and the flood. In a lot of cases, the flood model actually fits the data better and answers questions that plague the secular scientific models. But you wouldn't know that until you get into it. Right? Now, we're going to bring the science, but please don't let that intimidate you. I promise there's not going to be a paper or a quiz at the end. Right? You don't have to remember all the details, but I promise you're going to walk out of the talk being more assured in your faith and have at least some information to be able to answer the critics and the cynics. So please join me February 24th, March 3rd, and March 10th from 6:30 to 8 to be drowning in proof. Hey, it's Brandon, and I'm excited to announce that we're doing another apologetic series.
Or you're here live, we appreciate you being here. Brandon has been at HHC for several years. I think we're going back maybe 8 to 10 years probably, maybe, here at Hoosier Harvest. And this is the third, I believe, full class that he has done. It's been a while since he's done one, but he's also in charge of Gentry Martial Arts, which many of you are familiar with here in the Martinsville community. I'm not going to do anything like, our real connection is we both like the Kung Fu Panda movies. That's how we ended up connecting, is we both like those were top notch, man, top notch. So I'm just going to let him take it away. You put on your, get your, your feed bag on, because you're going to be eating a lot of food for the next few weeks. So, ladies and gentlemen, give a nice Hoosier Harvest welcome to Mr. Brandon Sieg. Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you. And so, thank you for that. I need to give thanks to a lot of people first. For starters, thank you, God, for opening my eyes to this subject and giving me the passion and what I think is an ability to teach and guide in this, and I hope you agree with that. But I need to thank the Chris and the leadership here at HHC for the opportunity. Came across my Facebook feed. This is pretty much 7 years to the day that I did my first talk in the youth ministry on evolution here, and so they've continued to let me come back and trust that I'm not going to go too off script or whatever on doing these things. So I appreciate that opportunity. I need to thank my wife Jen. This took a lot of time sequestered in my office studying and reading and things like that, and that time could have been spent more interactive or doing more things around the house, so I appreciate the opportunity to be able to do that. I need to thank all of you guys for coming. I appreciate that. And I need to give one special thanks, everybody up there in the AV group, but especially Ryan Spires, who not only listens to me talk in martial arts, has been listening to me drone on for 10 years now as one of our more accomplished students, but has been kind of the slide guy for all of my talks here. So for listening to me talk for hours in this stuff. So he deserves a medal, if not at least an applause. So thank you, Ryan. I appreciate it very much for your continued friendship and support in that regard. He needs a special shout out. And as I said, again, thank you for coming. Obviously, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but let me start by explaining why this is so important to me and why I feel like it should be important to everybody. A 2015 poll asked Americans if they believe the Ark was actually built or just a legend. For those people over the age of 60, 86% of the people believed it was built. For those in their 20s, that number dropped to 52%. Now, as this was just a general public study and not solely just churchgoers, I'm actually kind of surprised it was that high. But I can tell you with certainty that if I polled my college students, I would have lower numbers than that. And I think the trend in church is pretty much the same. When you've been told in science classes for most of your life that evolution is true and the earth is billions of years old, it's a little harder to keep the faith. During my last series on the series of talks on the young earth and creationism, I got feedback from someone who basically rhetorically asked why I spent so much time talking on evolution when everybody knows that evolution isn't true. Well, I don't know her exact age, but I'm willing to put her in that 86% bracket. Okay? And I'm going to push back a little bit. And while that might be their experience, as someone who was formerly in the scientific field, who has a daughter in college now in the hard sciences, and who is still on university campuses, I would push back and say that their experience is far from universal, even among Christians. And the bigger problem is that a lot of people might say they know evolution isn't true, but if pressed, can offer up no scientific explanation as to why it isn't true. It's pretty hard to find the scientific alternatives that support Genesis. Now, please notice I didn't say an alternative to science, which is what most people think you have to do to believe in Noah's Ark, is to suspend your belief in science. No, I said a scientifically grounded alternative interpretation of data and observations. But secular science is trying to remove those alternatives from even consideration.
I came across this very accurate analogy for what's going on. I shared it on the video in church last week. Let's say you witness Mount St. Helens erupt and see the devastation and geological processes, many of which give us insight into the type of catastrophic processes that were at work during Noah's flood. Now, you document an account of your experience for posterity. Geologists, 200 years from now, look at that same geological evidence and conclude it was millions of years of erosion. They say you made up a fable or some allegory for, some higher purpose, things like that. Ultimately, they get laws passed to declare it illegal to say that in public schools there ever was an eruption. That's a pretty good analogy. Right? What's amazing is Peter prophesied about that very denial of the flood in 2 Peter 3 through 7, that scoffers will come in the last days. They will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. Now let me insert and say that this could be a prophecy of deep time and uniformitarianism, that the slow processes have continued for eons. Okay, but back to Scripture. For they deliberately overlook this fact, that the heavens existed long ago, the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by means of the world that then existed was deluged with water and perish. Peter prophesied of people being willingly ignorant of the evidence for the flood. And if you refuse to believe in the evidence of a previous judgment, then it's a lot easier to deny the possibility of a future judgment. We are called to defend our faith. Defending doesn't mean just proclaiming it. It means being able to explain why. Ephesians 6, 10 through 17, taking up the armor of God. Everybody knows that passage, but it says, having done all, first things first, it says, having done all, to stand first, to stand firm. Done all first, prepared to answer. And I can personally attest the importance of this, of my study in this field to my faith. I certainly have failed in many ways to be Christ-like, in some really big ways. But one thing that remained unshakable is my faith, because it isn't blind faith. It is verified by my understanding of the world, and that includes the disciplines of science. We are here in church because we believe that Jesus is who he said he was and rose from the dead. Not because he said some wise words and taught us some morals and to love. He did those things too. But Christianity is solely based on a belief in the historical accuracy of a miracle, that the Son of the living God became man, walked among us, died, and rose from the dead. Now, we can have a personal experience with the very much alive Jesus, but many a conversion, including some well-known ones like Lee Strobel, came from investigating the evidence because it overwhelmingly supports the historical account. If you are here because you believe that, but then you had your question that God could use supernatural events in a worldwide flood, then you're not being intellectually consistent. Now, the science can get hard for the layman and even sometimes even other scientists when they cross disciplines. And in this talk, we're going to bring some science, the mechanisms and processes of the flood, the feasibility of the ark design and capacity, biological evidence to support animals from the ark diversifying, the geological evidence of rocks and the fossil record that actually support the flood hypothesis, and anthropological support. Now, you don't have to understand or remember all of it, but just getting the gist here and there, I believe, will strengthen your faith and help you answer critics. Martin Luther said, if I profess with the loudest voice and clearest exposition every portion of the truth of God except precisely that little point which the world and the devil are at that moment attacking, I am not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing Christ. Where the battle rages, there the loyalty of the soldier is proved, and to be steady on all the battlefield besides is mere flight and disgrace if he flinches at that point. I can tell you that Satan and this world are attacking the hearts and minds of younger generations through secular science that ignores the evidence for the flood. That is where the battle is raging. And yes, as I've said, the science can be intimidating, but don't flinch away from it. Say that you've done all. Now, instead, a lot of people do one of two things. Either they compartmentalize and ignore the intellectual consistency, or they compromise. One such one such compromise is that science tells us it is ridiculous to have a global flood, so it must be some type of myth. Now, keep in mind, the Kraken at one point was also a myth, but there are giant squid, right? But as logic goes, myth is grounded in some truth, so it was probably just a really bad local flood, one that devastated Mesopotamia, and Noah was confused and thought it was a global flood. We've all heard something to that effect, right? Interesting to note that we recognize the intelligence of ancient peoples, from Greek philosophy to the building of the pyramids. We still wonder how they built the pyramids. Okay? But we assume that they can't tell the difference between a global flood and a historically bad case of a river overflowing its banks. Now let's look at the logic of a regional flood. Immediately, several questions become obvious with the account. Why did Noah spend 100 years building an ark when he could just move? It's been proposed for theatrics in order to preach from the masses from the scaffolding. But the Bible says the purpose was to save Noah and the animals, not to witness. Further, Noah doesn't seem to be in on this symbolic statement. He thinks the world's ending, which means God used deception, and that's clearly not in his nature. Point number 2, why couldn't all those that were judged also escape their region? 3, why were there birds on the ark? Couldn't they just flown away? Similarly, other animals surely live beyond that region, right? So why did they have to be saved to repopulate? 4, how does a flood stay local for a year? What local flood persists 150 days after the rain stops? 5, how could an ark land upstream in the mountains when the rivers below are what flooded? 6, the language used is repetition of universal terms. To describe destroying all the animals on earth is similar to the earlier usage in describing creating all animals on earth. That doesn't suggest local. Now, doesn't always mean all, but you use in context, you can tell which, usually what it's meant. In Genesis 6 through 9, there's a 60-fold use of these words. It's pretty emphatic, they mean all. The Hebrew word for flood in Genesis 6 through 11 is mabul. In these chapters, 12 times God uses that Hebrew word. It only appears one other time in the Old Testament, and that's in Psalms, where it's undoubtedly referring to Noah's flood, since they're talking about the flood, not just a flood, the flood. Okay. All other floods, literal and metaphorical, in the Old Testament are described with a different word. Similarly, in Greek translation, the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, the Greek word kataklysmos, from where we get the English cataclysm, is used only in reference to Noah's flood. Hebrew has several terms for various levels of precipitation, just like we have sprinkle, drizzle, downpour. Okay? You would think in an arid region that doesn't have a lot of rain, they might have even more specific terms. Okay? None of those words, including the ones for the heaviest rains, are used to describe the flood. The same term used to describe water from the rock in Exodus is used to describe the bursting forth of the great deep. Now, it could be from land, but science says it's probably from the oceans, but still. Okay? It's also used in Numbers when it describes the earthquake that swallowed up Korah and his family. These describe a cataclysmic event, not a local flood. Point number 7, the post-flood command. God directs the animals in Noah's family to repopulate the earth. This makes no sense if it was local. It's only necessary if it was a global flood. Otherwise, nothing was ever unpopulated to be repopulated. Number 8, the rainbow testimony. The rainbow testifies it will never happen again, but local floods certainly do. So either the rainbow covenant with Noah was not universal, or any other local flood violates God's covenant. There's also a theological implication of a local flood. Noah was saved because of his righteousness. If others elsewhere lived, then either they were righteous or the wicked lived also due to either luck or ingenuity. Neither of those are viable to reconcile with the story of the Bible. So the local flood compromise doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It sounds good and is an easy out if you want to look at things superficially. It is a greenbelt argument, right? So, as Chris mentioned, as many of you know, I went to school for biological research, but I switch gears to become a professional martial arts instructor. Okay, and it's a common opinion in martial arts that the most dangerous people in the room are not the black belts; it's the middle ranks, like a green belt. Now that seems odd, but while the black belts might have more power, knowledge, whatever, right, they also have more experience and more control. The green belts, they know just enough to be dangerous, sometimes to themselves, sometimes to other people, right? Sorry, Zach, right? But still, right? They're working on it, but they might not have the control and the experience to safely to use that newfound power. Now they can beat novices, but they also don't know what they don't know. So here are a few examples of what I call greenbelt scientific objections to the flood. In other words, the person knows enough about some science argument, and they think they're offering a foolproof argument, at least against novices. Maybe it's a gotcha moment for a white belt, but I want you guys to be black belts and understand how these are not really all that sophisticated. Okay. The passengers on the ark would have needed oxygen masks to float above the Himalayas, right? Because they've been so high in altitude. So even if the water could have covered the mountains, they would have died. Well, first of all, atmospheric pressure is relative to sea level. So if sea level rises, pressure follows. So it wouldn't have been any different than being at the beach. Now, disembarking after the water drop could be a different story. We'll discuss that in a little while. But the bigger issue is it shows a pretty gross misunderstanding of the current prevalent scientific view of the flood. A major assumption, almost a given, is the topography of the continents in the antediluvian world. Now that's a fancy name for meaning before the flood. Okay, but the topography was very different than after. I mean, think about the amount of erosion in a worldwide flood with tsunamis and everything else. Okay, that would have caused. So we'll go into specifics later, but for most of the mountains that we have today are a consequence of the flood. They were growing during and after. In fact, Everest is part of the same mountain belt as Mount Ararat, and it is still rising today. And it is the flood model that best explains the fact that you see marine fossils on top of the Himalayas. Again, more on that later. Okay. Now, this, by the way, also is another stumbling block and supposed problem with Genesis, more broadly, the four rivers. The Bible says that the main river of Eden splits into four rivers. Pishon, which is in or near Assyria, Gihon, which is supposedly in Kush, which we associate with Ethiopia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which are well-known rivers today, but they clearly do not have the same source. And the first two, no one really has any clue about. So how do you get a common river to fork into rivers in Egypt and Mesopotamia, or explain the Tigris and Euphrates? Well, you don't. The antediluvian topography is gone. It was washed away. We will never know what it looked like on this side of heaven. It is very reasonable to assume, however, that when Noah's sons and their descendants repopulated the earth, upon coming upon a new landscape, they would name the new rivers after what they knew in the past. I mean, we certainly did it when we came here. We named things after there's New York. That implies an old York. I think they just call it York. And I had to look it up, but yes, there's a Jersey. It's an island in the channel. Okay. And more specifically, we do that in Indiana. We name things after European cities, but we love to mispronounce them. Right, so we have Milan instead of Milan. We have Versailles instead of Versailles. We have Edinburgh instead of Edinburgh. We have Raglafart instead of Trafalgar. Okay, right? So now, but wouldn't you expect a homesick family in a completely new world, like being dropped off on another planet, to do the same? Right? Now, a related criticism is to ask, where did all the water that was needed to cover Everest go? Well, now you kind of know the main answer. The topography was different. But if you leveled off all the land on the earth, it would be 1.6 miles below sea level. The water just happens to be collected in deep sea trenches. And there's also large subterranean lakes. There's plenty of water. But as Psalm 104 says, the mountains rose, the valleys sank into the place you established for them. You set a boundary so that they will not return to cover the earth. Return. That implies they were once there. Here's another one from a Greenbelt scoffer. How did Noah get all the animals collected, even if they came to him? How long before Noah was born did the sloths have to start to make their way to South America from the to the Middle East, or snails? And these animals don't have migration patterns or anywhere like that. Well, now, first of all, we cannot deny that a worldwide event like the flood, by definition, is a supernatural event. And we would expect certain elements of that account to have that. The gathering of the animals to Noah certainly includes a supernatural element. But again, the pre-flood world was different, almost certainly one continent. These scoffers apparently don't know about the supercontinent Pangaea. Most everyone knows that if you look at a global map, you can jigsaw the continents together and mash them into one large supercontinent. Although plate tectonics did not appear until the 1960s, in 1858-59, creationist Antonio Pellegrini proposed the continents fit together and were pulled apart by powerful forces from within the earth, which he attributed to the flood. Actually, before him, another guy by the name of Burnett in the 1600s proposed cracks in the earth were caused by the flood. Pellegrini's proposal was at the height of Lyell's uniformitarian process revolution in geology, the idea that slow, deliberate processes over millions and billions of years were what made the geologic record. So Pellegrini's idea didn't sniff adequate consideration. Another scientist by the name of Wagner proposed continental drift in 1915. And it wasn't another 50 years after that, in the 1960s, before the idea of continental drift and plate tectonics actually became accepted by geology. But by then, Lyell's uniformitarianism had become dogma. So drift was only considered within the framework of long ages and deep time. So here's another example, like Blythe and natural selection. So if you don't remember from one of my other talks or don't know, Blythe proposed natural selection before Darwin. He used it to explain how speciation, speciation of the animals after disembarkment from the ark led to biological diversity that we see today. Okay? But here's another example where creation scientists' work was originally ignored, but later the principle was used against creation instead of for it. Of course, the real issue at hand is the denial of the young earth, an earth consistent with the flood account. Secular science has taken the philosophical position that it is committed to billions of years, because Big Bang cosmology, uniform genealogy, and evolution are committed to and require it. If you sat through my other talks, well, first of all, bless you, but you know that for some of the problems of those theories, and that deep time really doesn't help. And we will revisit some of those issues, but in a way that looks more specifically at the flood. Okay? But here's one I like to share. Observational studies in biological molecules like DNA reveal that when they are exposed to the environment, they decay with a half-life of tens to thousands of years, depending on the molecule. Okay? Consequently, if deep time were real, there should not be any of these biomolecules preserved beyond hundreds of thousands of years. However, abundant research in recent years is finding increasingly convincing evidence that proteins and possible even DNA exists in clearly identifiable form in fossils, even in the Paleozoic, which is supposedly 250 million years ago. So here's a more dangerous example. This is an account from Science 1994 of a T-Rex bone found that still had tissue on it. The femur looked fresh. It was elastic. The red blood cells could be squeezed out of the blood vessels in solution. It was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. By the way, they've also found soft tissue of Triceratops and hadrosaurs. Yes, Jurassic Park is a real possibility. Okay. But here's a comment. Of course, I couldn't believe it. The bones are, after all, 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? Dr. Mary Schweitzer. It flies in the face of everything we understand about how tissues and cells degrade. So what we observe to be true, that these bones possibly couldn't be that old and still have those qualities, was ignored to keep the faith of long ages associated with the fossil record. Instead of them believing in the miracle of the flood, they chose to believe in the miracle of 65 million year old blood cells that defies all we know about biological molecule decay. Some would use the supposed evidence of long ages against the Bible and say that if God really made a young earth, then God is deceiving us with such scientific evidence. Now, there's one theory that applies to our ages discussion, such as radioactive dating, but is also somewhat theological. Okay? If God made a mature world, and it certainly seems as though he did, Adam was created as a grown, intelligent adult. God didn't leave a helpless baby to name the animals. Otherwise, everything would be either goo-goo or gaga, right? The plants and animals were also grown. Adam did not name eggs. Now, I realize some of you won't be listening to the next few things I say because you're processing that answers the age-old question of which came first. But for those of you who are ready to move on, okay, if God used certain processes in creation, for example, radioactive decay to heat the core of the earth, then the resulting elements were created in week 1. This isn't deception, but it does give the appearance of age. So imagine that to accomplish his plan, God used scientific processes to interact with the earth in ways that left evidence that could be misinterpreted. But he then told us what he did so we wouldn't be misled. The problem isn't that God deceived us. The problem is that we don't believe what he told us. Of course, the record of his activity is in the account in the Bible. Now, that's not the only account. And one of the major pillars that supports the Noah's flood was that Noah's flood was an actual global event is the historical and anthropological accounts of a global flood from around the world. So before we get into the feasibility and scientific evidence for the flood, let's look at the evidence in these areas. And as I discuss it, just like the sciences, I want you to see how secular academics in these fields show bias against the Bible or completely contradict their own standard practices when it comes to the flood. Now, when you start talking about myths or legends, one is quick to note that such evidence is circumstantial. But let's look at it the other way. If you're an anthropologist and you want to disprove an account of a worldwide event, one of the first things you would point to or refute, or use to refute it, was a lack of accounts from around the world, from various independent cultures. Would you not? If it really happened, it wouldn't just be one person saying so. It would be everyone in the world would agree. Right? So here is that very thing happening, and yet anthropologists come up with other explanations. Depending on who you ask or what study, the number of flood traditions around the world vary, but some of the discrepancy is whether the flood legend is explicitly global or not. Okay? LaHaye and Morris was an older study, but documented 200 flood legends. 95% were global, representing 70 different languages. The number of known global flood legends is now at least 300, with another 200 to 300 where the flood scope isn't clear. So that number could be as many as 500 to 600 flood legends around the world. Some of these cultures don't even experience flooding. They have other natural disasters, but they don't even flood. Yet they have a flood legend. The 300 include Aztec, Hawaiian, Chinese, and the Mao people, Tanzania. Now, these aren't accounts that just say a flood happened. God told a righteous man to take his family into a boat, take seed or food with them, and a pair of each animal with them. The animals needed to be saved to repopulate the earth. A flood covered the mountains and destroyed all life. They sent a dove out to check if it was dry before they disembarked. The Mao account lists 40 days of rain and a sacrifice of a bull afterwards. Several flood versions have 8 passengers. On a related note, in ancient Chinese, the character for flood is comprised of the characters for total plus cover. Total is comprised of 8 plus united plus earth. So altogether, there are 8 people on the ark, so the total number on earth is 8, united on the ark, while the flood totally covers the earth. In addition, boat equals vessel plus 8 plus mouth. That implies 8 mouths to feed on the ark, on the boat. Most accounts have animals playing part in surveying the new earth. That's often birds. The vessel lands on a mountain peak. The mountain varies, but it would be understandable that they chose a peak that they are familiar with rather than some abstract mountain somewhere else. Okay? As we previously discussed, the pre-flood world was likely one continent. Some of the other legends specifically mention the changing of topography. The Icelandic epic Edda says the mountains clash together and the earth sinks to the sea. People from Asram, which is in India, Assam, an ethnic group in India, say that prior to the flood, the earth was one flat plain, but the water carved out the mountains and valleys we see today. One New Zealand flood account states that when people disembark, they were dismayed because everything had changed. Now, current anthropology requires that there was a dispersion of people from the cradle of civilization to around the world, each developing its own culture. And from then, each culture developed its own flood legend. Genesis states there was one global flood event which resulted in, through the Tower of Babel, a dispersion of cultures from around the world. And all of them retained such a monumental event as the flood. Which would any honest, non-biased person think is more likely? People from around the world all came up with the same story independently, or one story was shared by everybody who then dispersed? Admittedly, we expect some distortion from the original. Most other legends have additions outside the biblical account. Actions of polytheistic gods, for example. If Mesopotamia was the cradle of civilization, then one would expect one of those regional versions to be the original, and all the others were a result of dispersion. So that leaves basically two accounts, Noah and the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is Babylonian. Gilgamesh is not feasible in terms of ship shape and size, and Gilgamesh became immortal. So it doesn't ring as historic. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But some suggest you can see the trend and distortion of the Noah story as you move away from the generally accepted trends or patterns of dispersion. For example, some legends have a fish in the story. The details about the fish vary, but the fish element is connected by more closely related peoples. Or you can see as you move further north, animals become reindeer instead of other things. Okay? As we discussed in the talk on the Age of Man, note that with the Tower of Babel, patriarch names were likely changed as the languages did. Some versions remain closer to the original than others. Others have Noah as possibly other names. Similarly with dispersion, other details change. A duck instead of a dove, a canoe instead of an ark. Many of these legends actually have the wife of Noah's wife, which the Bible doesn't list. Okay? But the wife's name shows similarity across cultures. Okay? As mentioned, anthropology shows current humans migrated outward from the Middle East, including into Africa. And this is exactly what the Bible says the sons of Noah did. But we see a rapid expansion around 10,000 years ago. Now that's a little too early for the Genesis account, but the dating's off a little bit, but the general trend lines up. So that leaves ancient Near Eastern accounts, like the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh and Noah in the Bible, as the most prominent, as the best source of the original flood story. Many secular scholars assert that Gilgamesh is the older original version. They cite the numerous similarities between the biblical flood to the Gilgamesh epic and insist that the Bible is an adaptation of the Babylonian legend. Now, there are many similarities: calling man into the ark, the closing of the door, the sending of the birds after, sacrifices after. People love to cite the similarities, but never seem to want to look at the glaring differences. The Babylonian account shows capricious gods, much like fighting and intrigue in Greek mythology, who lose control of the storm. The ark is a 120 by 120 by 120 foot cube with 9 decks. It also includes all the craftsmen who built it and the hero's treasure of gold and silver. It's also a steering boat and includes helmsmen to steer. The ark is a barge that floats listlessly. Now, if we consistently applied evolution, wouldn't we assume the more primitive boat was the original? And on feasibility, anyone think a 9-level cube is a good boat design? Naturally, one influenced the other, but which seems to ring more true as narrative and which one was corrupted by legend? Some will assert that the Bible account is special or a different literary genre, but it is written in narrative prose, not poetry or myth. For comparative purposes, Genesis 10 alone has 5 times as much geographic data as the entire Quran. And it is consistent in style with the rest of the Bible, the historical narrative such as the Book of Kings. There is a complete absence of mythology that is present in other ancient Near Eastern accounts. Yes, they both have a supernatural element in it, but that doesn't make the Bible non-historical unless you choose to remove God from history. So let me point out the discrepancy here. History and anthropology will offhandedly dismiss the overwhelmingly consistent themes across 300 legends or more from around the world, citing the differences. Okay? But then we'll ignore the differences between Gilgamesh and Noah. Those that really distinguish myth from historical narrative, and focus on the similarities. Well, why? By clinging to the similarities between the two, when Gilgamesh is clearly myth, then Noah becomes myth too, and you avoid the possibility of an inconvenient truth that Noah is accurate. And by extension, the Bible is truth. They will contradict themselves to keep history secular. But the Bible isn't the only historical record that tells of the flood. There are plenty of external verifications of Genesis and Noah's flood throughout other histories. Not legends, histories. Ancient pagan cultures from Europe, the Middle East, and even the Mayans have a history of the world beginning at roughly 6,000 years. The Mayan calendar had the New Age starting their day count at the end of a catastrophic flood in 3,133 BC, which again is off by Genesis standards, but in the ballpark. Anglo-Saxon, British, Irish histories have origin dates 4,000 to 5,000 BC. Chinese, India, and Babylon, 5,300 to 6,000. Persia, 5,500. Not exact agreement, but after the Tower of Babel and people dispersed, you would expect the oral history to maybe get a little off, a little fuzzy. But cultures around the world in the same ballpark. Again, if all people and all around the world had independent histories that agreed, wouldn't you have to consider that as pretty accurate? There's a list of Sumerian kings. It lists the flood and gives the names and ages of the kings before and after the flood, and it correlates well with the Genesis account. Josephus is still regarded as one of the greatest historians in the ancient world. He writes about the flood and the patriarchs as history. Now, being that he was Jewish, that's not surprising. But he also mentions several contemporary historians who also have accounts of the flood and the ark. He cites them. These are not Jewish historians, and while their records don't exist as well today, okay, why would a historian cross-reference other historians that were presumably known at the time if it weren't true? Berosus wrote a history that included Adam, the flood, and the chronology of the Chaldean kings from Noah. Little exists of his books, but Josephus quotes Berosus in saying, "It is said there is still some part of this ship in Armenia at the mountain of the Chaldeans, and that some people carry off pieces of the bitumen, which they take away and use chiefly as amulets for averting of mischiefs." Josephus also quotes Nicholas of Damascus in his 96th book. "There is a great mountain in Armenia, over Minas, called Baris, upon which it is reported that many who fled at the time of the deluge were saved, and that one who was carried in an ark came on shore on top of it, and that the remains of the timber were great while preserved. This might be the man about whom Moses, the legislator of the Jews, wrote." Josephus also references 10 others, many of which I can't even pronounce their names, but that's a lot of verification by non-Hebrew historians. Beyond this, shortly after the flood, we have the sons of Noah being dispersed after the Tower of Babel, and we have many ancient histories that verify that part of the story. And we went into great detail on that in the talk called The Age of Man. But here are some cliff notes that are more relevant to Noah and the flood. As an overview, Japheth's descendants went always north, Europe and Asia. Europe from Scandinavia to Spain, Russia and Mongolia, Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Turkey. Ham's descendants went to Africa. His son Cush is tied with the Ethiopians in Sudan. Another son, Mizraim. Both the Bible and secular history agree he founded Egypt in 2188 BC. Shem is responsible for going to the Middle East and Arabia. Throughout history, these genealogies have been accepted. For example, there are accounts in the 1600s of tourists of English palaces viewing or going to see the genealogies that go back to Adam. Now, modern scholars, secular scholars, will say that those are forgeries or revisions by Christian monks who rewrote history. Here also, these scholars have a way of cherry-picking the parts that fit the narrative and ignoring plenty of examples of authenticity, because there are plenty of examples of either non-Christian countries or pagan sources that predate Christian conversion that verify the genealogy of the Table of Nations from Noah. Anglo-Saxons had their own history genealogy called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the oldest dating to 547 AD. But Augustine didn't arrive to convert the Anglo-Saxons until 50 years later in 597. They were still very much pagan. The chronicles trace 6 royal houses of the Anglo-Saxons back to connection to Danish and Norwegian genealogy, back to King Odin, who was a god to them. But Odin is listed as the 20th generation from Noah in the genealogy. The chronicle goes down through the people like Alfred the Great and the House of Wessex, for example, but Japheth is called Scef. One account in the early pagan Saxons basically says Scef was Noah's son, was born on the ark. Now note, Japheth helped build the ark, not born in it, according to Genesis, but further later Christianized Saxons used the term Japheth, not Scef. So Christian monks forging the genealogies would use an obscure name and make the mistake about the ark? Well, that's a small factual error, but it overall suggests authenticity. There are royal genealogies of both the Danes and the Norwegians coming from 6 lists from 4 different nations, including Iceland, and they all agree. They have omissions in places, not the same ones, but the shared sequence of names are in agreement. They include very pagan Vikings who trace their line, again, back to Odin, the 17th or 18th generation of Noah, and ultimately back to Japheth. In Ireland, Keating in his history dating to the 1600s cites no less than 4 other ancient manuscripts from the 1200s. And what is interesting, in those manuscripts source even older books, specifically one called the Book of Invasions, which was compiled in 365 AD, again when the Irish were pagan. This genealogy has the Irish being related to Magog and the Scythians. Now, that's interesting because the rest of Europe traces their genealogy, their origins, back to a different son of Japheth. Okay? Furthermore, the historian Cusack notes that ancient Irish pedigrees were taken very seriously for legal rights to land and government, and meticulous record-keeping of the genealogies were taken, even in pre-Christian Ireland, which works against the argument that monks forged history later. Shem could have continued past India all the way into China. The first dynasty in China was Zhou, listed from 21 to 1700 BC, or 150 years after the flood. It ends 50 years after Shem's death. Supposedly, the Yellow Emperor led people from Mesopotamia to China. According to Confucius, the first Zhou emperor, named Shun, sounds like a lot like Shem, but may or may not have been, offered the first border sacrifice to Shangdi, the heavenly ruler. The border sacrifice is amazingly similar to the sacrifices in the Bible. The Mao people is an ethnic group in southern China, whose history dates to the 10th generation of the sage leaders whose name was Yu. Yu made a ship to survive a great flood, and all people are descendants of Yu. There is a legend of the 3 august ones that existed before Shun, who had magical powers and lived exceedingly long lives. 2 were Fuxi and Nuwa, the god and goddess who created all mankind. Now note in this legend, Nuwa, maybe Noah, is actually the mother of mankind, not the father. Okay, but still. The 3rd was Shenang, who was also thought to be the Yellow Emperor. This could be Shem. Again, maybe not. Miaotzu people are another group of tribes in China that share a common ancestor, Seguing. Ancient Chinese histories list Seguing's genealogy back to Gomen, maybe Gomer, the son of La Japhu, Japheth, the son of Noah. Noah built a large boat to survive a flood. It also lists other sons of Noah as Lohan, Ham, Lo-Shen, Shem. The sons of Lohan include Kusa, Cush, and Mesei, Mizraim. And the sons of Lo-Shem as Elam, and Nagashir, Asher. Now, there are differences in opinion on some of the Chinese genealogies, but the overwhelming coincidence remains the Chinese have a history congruent with Genesis. Maybe one of the best examples of this whole argument, this process, is Nennius. Nennius wrote the history of the Britons in the 8th century. He supposedly compiled older 5th century histories as well as oral traditions from Ireland and Wales. Many question his legitimacy and attack his sources. Some of these different works conflict in places, and some genealogies have minor errors or contradictions. Now, if he was making a comprehensive fake, again, why wouldn't he get those things worked out? But no, he simply records what the previous sources say, even if they're in conflict. He also has discrepancies between Genesis and Josephus' history. So again, if he was simply forging or plagiarizing these other sources, why the mistake here? most obvious answer was a legitimate independent compilation of history, right? The history that history includes having Noah's grandson founding the Gauls. Now, since he was a Welsh monk and he wrote about, for example, the battles of King Arthur, many say his work is suspect. It was either forged or liberties were taken. You can't tell history from legend. Now, isn't it ironic that while most people don't, believe in a magical sword, almost everybody accepts that there was a real King Arthur that the legend is built around. A lot of people think he was Roman, right? But people believe that there was an Arthur in some capacity, right? People are willing to believe that, but when we start talking about the sons of Noah, well, that's just Tommy rot. We can't believe that. Okay? So you see, there's plenty of external verification of the flood from around the world in both legend and in serious history. Again, secular historians are quick to acknowledge many myths are grounded in actual events, yet seemingly choose to ignore the worldwide prevalence of Noah flood accounts. All right. Of course, we believe that the Genesis account is the accurate historical version. And we all know the general story, or I'm assuming we do, but since we're going to dive deeper into the science of the flood and how it explains the world around us, we ought to become familiar with a couple of other nuances or details of the flood that isn't specifically addressed in the Bible, so we can still deduce some things. Okay? So for example, how big was the ark? Well, depends on what cubit you talk about. Cubics varied in the ancient Near East. But the Hebrew common cubit was approximately 18 inches, which is similar to the Egyptian short cubit, which the author of Genesis, Moses, would also be familiar. This makes the ark 450 feet in length, 75 in width, and 45 in height. 3 decks means 98,800 square feet, the equivalent of 20 basketball courts or 540 rail cars. Now, there is a long cubit that would make it more like 510 by 85 by 51. But note that the feasibility studies we're going to talk about in a minute assumed a smaller boat to make it harder for us to, to withstand criticism, right? They were more stringent. Okay. Here's another one that needs classification. Where did the ark land? On Mount Ararat, right? Well, the Bible doesn't always necessarily say that. It says it doesn't land on Ararat. It says it lands in the mountains of Ararat. Ararat is a mountain region spanning Turkey, Armenia, western Iran. Mount Ararat is the tallest peak at 16,000 feet, taller than anything in the continental United States. So it makes sense that this is the first peak that might be popped up. But the Bible does say the Bible says that other peaks weren't visible until later. But that could be a question of visibility. Fog kept them from seeing it. Not necessarily water recession. Okay. Also, that it's such a high peak now would be problematic for disembarkment in O2 levels since once the water's dropped. But it doesn't mean that it was the highest peak or it was that high at the time of the flood. Ararat is a volcano and lava flows and lack of fossils suggest a post-flood peak. Still, a lot of eyewitness and traditional historic references state the ark was on Ararat. Ararat is perpetually covered in glacier and snow, so it would be a perfect hiding spot for the people who believe that it is still up there. Maybe it's inhabited by Bigfoot. I don't know. Right? But at the same time, Ararat is also a volcano, so the ark probably could have been burned up at some point. Okay? More likely and more commonly, not only Jewish and Christian traditions, but also pagan and Muslim traditions have the ark landing on Mount Kuti. It's in the same mountain region, but at under 7,000 feet, it would have been more suitable for disembarkament, but it also means it was easily looted later on. There's a Muslim account that says they took the last beams of the ark to use in a mosque. Historian Whit Wigman recorded only 100 years ago a ceremony on Kuti where Jew, Christian, and Muslims came together for a yearly celebration to commemorate the sacrifices Noah made after the flood. So we know the range, but we may not know the actual mountain. Another conversation is the timeline of the waters in the flood. The Masoretic text is very conservative and well preserved and lists the dates of the flood as beginning on the 600th year of Noah, the 2nd month, the 17th day, and ending on the 601st year on the 2nd month, the 27th day, or 1 year and 110 or 111 days, depending on how you count the days inclusively. So by our standards, it started on February 17th on our calendar and lasted a total of 370 days, right? Well, depends on what calendar you use. Did Moses as the author use Noah's calendar or his own? Moses' readers were more likely familiar with his own, but that creates even more questions because Moses had 4 to choose from. All these had various adjustment days, like our leap year, like we had a leap year, right? And were those adjustments made? Now, there are 5 fixed dates in Noah's account, 7 if you count Noah entering 7 days from the ark, or 7 days prior to. Point number 1, the great deep broke forth and the windows of heavens opened at the start on the 17th day of the 2nd month of the 600 year of Noah. And then Noah comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat on the 17th day of the 7th month. And then the mountains appear and so on and so forth. You see, the chart, kind of gets you to the 370 days or 371 days inclusively. So 17th day of the 2nd month to the 17th day of the 7th month, the Bible says is 150 days. So that implies 30 days to a month calendar. This is a prevalent view for the calendar, the 30-day calendar month with no adjustment days for a grand total of 370 or 371, again, if the last day is inclusive. Okay. Another question is, when did the flood peak? There are 40 days of rain, and the ark was lifted off the ground. Genesis 7:18 says, then the waters continued to increase greatly to the point of 15 cubits, and then everything died in verse 22. By the end of 150 days, the ark was landed. By the way, 15 cubits above the earth, a standard cubit means about 26 feet above the earth. Okay? So, opinion number 1, day 40 was when the ark was lifted. The waters continued to rise until day 150, where all life was gone, and the water prevailed until day 150. Okay? Opinion 2, the flood peaked at day 40. The water prevailed simply meant that all Noah saw for the next 110 days when the ark was grounded was water. So in this version, Genesis 8:1 is a flashback to day 40. Water prevailing doesn't necessarily mean increasing. Opinion 3, the water peaked at day 40, stayed at the same level, windows in heaven weren't shut until the days 150. Okay? Now, admittedly, this really probably doesn't matter a whole lot one way or another. Okay? Some people, in terms of trying to figure out sea level changes, in terms of the geological record and things like that, they're trying to interpret it when the flood peaked. Okay? But for most people, it obviously doesn't matter too much. Okay? The prevalent view is, again, that the water continued to rise until day 150. Okay? Now, admittedly, all the legends and history of the world will not convince a person to maintain the history of the ark, the story of the ark, so scientific that, let me try that again. All the legends and history of the world will not convince a person who maintains that the story of the ark is so scientifically impossible that it can't be anything more than a widespread fairy tale. Now, obviously, a story about God flooding the earth is going to have a supernatural element to it. But it's a lot more scientifically feasible than most people realize. And being able to understand how the viability of the story is, how viable the story is one way for us to strengthen our faith against the scoffers. It maybe, just maybe, plant the seed of curiosity in the heart of a skeptic who doesn't know that you don't have to abandon all reason to believe. Okay? So, I know I've been going for a while. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come down the home stretch, and we're going to start talking about the feasibility of the flood. The feasibility of the ark, okay? And dimensions and whether it can carry the animals and everything else. But let's take 5, stretch, and, get a drink or whatever you need to do, and we'll pick up there. Okay, I hope not too many of you snuck out at break. Looks like everybody came back. So, a couple people asked, if you want, give me your email, and I'm happy to email you basically this verbatim. So yeah, I appreciate some of you guys trying to take notes and stuff, but I'd be happy to share more detail, the talk and everything. So I have no problem doing that. And then, yeah. All right. So we'll try to take a look at these kind of from a sequential order, right? As far as kind of the what happened in the process of the Noah's Ark. But first, Noah built the ark out of gopher wood. Gopher wood remains a mystery. It could be a type of wood, but more likely refers to some type of finishing or treating process that makes it harder, for example. Teak is a hardwood in the region. Ships made of teak are known to last a long time, so it would have easily lasted for a year-long voyage. The pitch that Noah used didn't have to be petroleum. There are other types. A common objection is that there was no pitch for Noah to use if fossil fuels were a result of the flood, which we'll discuss later. As stated, using the smallest cubit, the ark was 450 in length, 75 feet in width, and 45 feet high. Critics say shipbuilding capabilities were not that good in the ancient world, that there is no supporting archaeological evidence of large boats. Some say the Bronze Age boats were only cutouts, like canoes. The first large structures were less likely... First, large structures are less likely to be preserved, but that doesn't mean that they didn't exist. If archaeologists hundreds of years from now found your bass boat, right? That doesn't mean that they couldn't assume that we were primitive and assume that we didn't have fishing trawlers, right? But our argument or our rebuttal is far more than just an argument from silence. Bill Nye, in somewhat a well-known debate with creationist Ken Ham, states that he comes from a long line of shipbuilders, and he said wooden ships of that size are not viable. He cited the warship named Wyoming that registered 450 feet, the same length as the Ark, and Nye mentioned that it twisted and sank. Well, maybe that explains why he wasn't in the family business, because either he didn't know or conveniently failed to mention that it sank after 14 years of service. Keep in mind, the Ark had to only float for a year and 10 days. But Nye and those with those similar criticisms are not historically accurate. Chinese sea junks at the time of Marco Polo were significantly larger than ships used century later or that Europe built centuries later. 5,000 years ago, Chinese ships had rather advanced wooden joinery. In India, by 3000 to 1500 BC, there is evidence that they had a dock system for berthing ships that included a spillway, water lock, and a platform. The Greeks had a ship 425 feet that could ram other ships. Usher, in the Annals of the World, records that the Leontifer warship was at 400 to 500 feet, the ship of Demetrius at 400, Ptolemy's warship at 420. These included rowing stations or sails, not just a floating barge. Archaeology is also finding that ancient Greeks, much like the Chinese, had different shipbuilding practices that were better than later designs. Apparently, the technology was lost. A more specific criticism that is often used in that the ark construction was impossible is that a wooden ship that big would sag. But the ark design, long and shallow with a flat bottom, minimizes sag, and again ignores the examples above. The ancient Greeks had a ship described as a mashon at 4,000 tons. As mentioned, Chinese junks approached this, and there's additional evidence that some made just for lakes were even bigger. Now, note that the design of the ark has stood the test of time. The 6-to-1 length to width ratio is the common standard today. Dutch barges were modeled after the ark design and have been proven almost impossible to capsize. The Korea Research Institute for Ships and Engineering compared the ark to 12 other known hull forms and found the ark had superior safety, 13 times that of the American Bureau of Shipping standard for safety. It could withstand waves 30 meters or 100 feet high, and that doesn't mean it had to capsize it bigger. The apologist Morris said that it could basically be turned 90 degrees and still immediately right itself. Admittedly, I don't know if he was a ship expert, but still. But it is funny how these ancient people who didn't know that there was a local flood made up a boat that outperforms all other modern shipping designs. The next line of argument is there no way you could fit all the animals of the world onto the ark, let alone food, etc. And even if you could somehow, it'd be so overloaded it would have sunk. Now keep in mind, our imagination of the ark has been influenced by all the cute but unrealistic nursery or toddler toys, awkwardly high with the weird little turret at the top with giraffes and elephants spilling out of every space they have, right? Now, no doubt many of you have at least seen pictures of the ark encounter outside of Cincinnati. Several of you might have gone. It's a very worthwhile trip. Okay, I think my family's there, right? And so as you see, it doesn't look like the nursery rhymes. Okay? But let's get into the weeds on the argument. To summarize, one marine engineering study calculated an ark cargo mass of 17,000 tons. One study estimates on animals, food, and water comes to 11,000 tons. So that leaves 6,000 tons left over. For starters, the animal/space argument is not a very nuanced or well-informed argument. Species is an arbitrary modern construct in biology that has multiple working definitions as people argue about different species. There are 500 species of mosquitoes, and then there are dog breeds. Note that the taxonomic level of genus is really the smallest division that one can really typically ID something without specific study. I can remember fishing in Rough River, Kentucky, and we fished for white bass, and then there was Kentucky bass, and there was this hybrid, and they all had different lengths and quotas and everything else, right? And suppose you could tell by the markings on the side and then their tongues. And there were days where we spent more times feeling tongues and arguing about tongues than we did casting, right? Because you can't tell at the species level, that it's not that easy to tell, okay? Species is really splitting hairs. The only people who say that every species of animal is on the ark are those critics who think they are making you look dumb. But in fact, what they're doing is showing either their ignorance or maliciousness against the argument. The Bible doesn't say species. It says animals were taken onto the ark according to their kind. Now, Frank Marsh pioneered the kind argument called baromems, at least in biology, which baromems is Hebrew for created kind, as an alternative to the evolutionary classification model, and he did this in the 40s. Most suggest that the baromem is at the family level of classification, depending on the particular animal, possibly higher in some cases, and worse at the genus level. Now, there are many cases of interbreeding at the genus level. So what this means is you don't need every type of dog represented on the ark. You just need one canine that represents it's probably more like a wolf, that represents all types of dogs. You need one saber-toothed type looking cat that all cats, felines, wild and domestic, have come from. Horses, zebras, mules, all one baromem. Okay? You get the idea. Okay? Now, this argument is internally consistent with the Bible. While the good book consistently shows scientific understanding beyond its time in history, which is another line of evidence for its divine revelation, it was written for everyone who was not a 21st century biologist studying hundreds of species of fruit flies. Okay? Leviticus lists of clean and unclean animals are larger than the species level. They were not feeling fish tongues to see whether they could eat it or not. So it is internally consistent to consider kinds at the family or subfamily level. This is especially maybe important when it comes to the 7 pairs of clean animals. Not multiple pairs of every species of cow was on the ark. The Jewish tradition holds that the Leviticus list is complete. So again, on terms of internal consistency of the Bible, just a few domesticated animals were needed. Woodmarap in 1996 did a feasibility study on the ark based on the genus level, which came to 16,000 animals. Now remember, the family level would be even easier to fit. Many extinct dinosaurs and large mammals are likely to have an inflated number of genus because, well, one, we don't know too much about them, and two, if you discover a dinosaur or something, it's a lot cooler if you find a new dinosaur than another version of an old dinosaur, right? So these things tend to get split more than not. Okay, so again, the genus of dinosaurs is probably overinflated. But he used a conservative 16,000 number at the genus level to make the problem more challenging to fit the animals, to bolster his defense against criticism. He noted that the likely estimate of ark inhabitants, if we stay closer to the family level, was closer to 2,000. Now, more recent estimates of the ark kinds number, for example, at 196 existing bird kinds, up to 300 existing and fossil mammal kinds, 101 extant reptile kinds, 248 extant and fossil amphibian kinds, 27 potential dinosaur baromins. Now, that's not an exhaustive list of kinds, but it provides insight to the effective group size necessary to rescue the genetic potential of all the created kinds and deliver them to a new world. If these numbers are accurate, it shows that we're nowhere close to even 16,000. So 16,000 still seems like a lot, but is it problematic? The overwhelming number of animals are small. There would only be a handful of large animals like sauropods that would have a disproportionate effect on size and weight. Woodman calculated the body mass for just about all the animals alive and extinct. 16,000 animals on the ark. The median size of the animal was the size of a rat. And then there are juveniles of the large animals. Only 1% of all the animals on the ark needed to be bigger than the size of a sheep. Even assuming the smallest definition of a cubit, only half of the ark floor space was needed for containment. And that doesn't take into account stacking enclosures. So a more accurate measure might be volume, which comes to based on those numbers above, comes to about 1/4 of the volume. So there is plenty of room. Based on other figures, crowding in the ark was significantly less than most indoor farm housing today. Or if you want a darker example, it was 15 times less crowded than humans at Auschwitz. Besides, small spaces actually keep the animals calmer with less chance of injury. Now, how could you collect or load that many animals? A common criticism of the size they couldn't fit in the ark is that there was no way Noah could even load that many, that it would take too long. Noah had to wait on the sloths and snails to go up the ramp, or good luck coaxing a stubborn hippo to use the ramp. First, the ancient Greeks brought rhinos from Africa. Romans brought crocodiles from the Nile. Hannibal had war elephants, right? So don't underestimate ancient people's ability to manage animals. But more importantly, this ignores the supernatural element here, which again, it has to be part of the story. It says God helped. But for comparison, let's look at slaughterhouse intake of animals larger than the ark. Hogs enter at 1,000 per hour. Smaller animals can be processed faster. So it would have been a long day for sure, but maybe not impossible for Noah and his family. Again, God probably helped facilitate this also. Yes, we are looking in this talk about feasibility and evidence, but if we take all the supernatural out of it, then it isn't a miracle at all. And it clearly was. And we aren't trying to say that the flood happened in such a way that God wasn't at work, right? Now, sidebar, this also addresses another minor criticism, and that is that Noah had to be such an expert on all the animals that, for example, he had to make sure that he had one male and one female of species that are monomorphic. In other words, they look the same to the point that even experts have a hard time identifying which one is male and female. Okay? Do you think that God, while orchestrating all this, would supernaturally send two males to Noah just to trick him? But then again, the criticism also assumes that such a species-specific trait existed at the Baromim kind in the ark and didn't evolve or diversify later. Now listen close, because I'm going to be repeatedly referencing two important concepts moving forward while discussing other similar criticisms. First, this is an emergency situation, survival against disaster. Critics of the ark expect it to be a floating zoo where one deck is a polar bear enclosure and the next is the plains of the Serengeti or something. Okay. No, Noah didn't have to be familiar with all the animals like a zookeeper. He just had to keep them alive for a year. Okay? The Roman Emperor Trajan had 11,000 wild animals and domesticated animals in his collection. I'm going to guess those tigers were mostly in cages, not roaming the palace. Right? What animals can tolerate and survive for short durations versus their preferred habits and living conditions, diets, etc., are completely different questions. And a lot of tolerance goes to point number 2. Hardiness of stock. It is true that certain species do not do well in captivity, but species that are closely related to them are just fine. Bats, parrots, lizards, all vary species to species. Microevolutionary changes, speciation differences after the flood that didn't have to be there at the kind level. Some of their relatives are quite hardy, and we would expect those traits to be in their ancestors in the ark. Even within a species, there's a huge variation in hardiness among individuals. Any dog owner can note individual personalities in dogs. My brother-in-law had a boxer that was a nervous Nelly and was afraid of storms. That dog needed doggy downers. Okay? We can safely conclude that Jack, bless his soul, would not have been selected for the ark voyage. Okay? Now, if Noah had gathered animals in advance, as Genesis states, perhaps he had a chance to weed out the weak ones. But this also ignores the supernatural element of the whole story. We would assume God would direct the most hardy and tolerant stock to the ark. God wouldn't send a weak one that couldn't handle his plan. Also recall that animals in the ark were in the ark for a week before the storm to get accustomed to the enclosures before the added stress. Today, we recommend animals ranging from Australian possums, called couscouses, to rhinos to be in their crates 1 to 2 weeks before actual transport. It's funny how these coincidences in time always keep popping up in the Bible. The hardiness issue also addresses another minor criticism, and we said that animals could have been juveniles to reduce space. But skeptics point out that juveniles are more prone to death. They have higher death rates. But it goes back to hardiness, either supernaturally by Noah or by Noah, they would have chosen the hardiest of stock, okay, and that would have remedied that. So there's evidence the animals could fit in the ark, but surviving the ark for a year is a different matter. What about food, waste, ventilation, caring for the animals? Okay. The typical criticism assumes that you need a floating zoo. But in such an emergency, perhaps a better modern comparison would be a factory farm, where 100,000 animals are typically taken care of with only minimal staffing, a few humans. I talk for a living. So food is both a volume concern and a manpower issue. Okay? How do you store that volume of food for 16,000 animals for a year, preserve it, and also feed the animals? These questions create several objections or criticisms. The first involves storage and spoilage. Food dried enough minimizes space and weight and often keeps longer. Detractors cite the bulk and volume of hay. Animals like horses need some hay or some other fiber source, but oats can be used to substitute for hay. Genesis and ancient people switched these animals to grain. You couldn't use pack animals in the desert if they had to carry all their own hay with them. Okay? Further, hay could have been further compressed, even if not to pellet size. Woodman-Rupp calculates if food stores were 80% grain and 20% hay, only 15.4% of ark volume was used for food. Compressing hay by half drops it to 11%. At 80% dried, 2,500 tons could be carried. Water at 4.07 million liters is 9.4% of ark volume. Keep in mind, we're not feeding full-size elements. Only 1% were sheep size or bigger. Leviticus and other ancient people demonstrate that people know how to dry grain, meats, plants. Year-old hay has been fed to a variety of animals. The Chinese have a way to preserve eggs for a year. Even if the ark was moist, watertight containers could protect food stores. So remember those two things. Hardiness of both ancestor kind compared to the post-flood microevolved niche species, and hardiness of individual animals, and that this was also an emergency situation. Any dietary problems, if they did arise, were probably not emergencies. A common criticism is that animal diets had to be close to natural. Pandas needed bamboo, for example. But zoos have realized diets do not have to reflect natural diet. One zoo kept an elephant alive on 2 kilograms of wheat cake a day. That was during war rations. Okay? King Louis XIV kept an elephant alive 13 years on gruel, wine, and bread. It was probably abuse, but it does show that dietary requirements are exaggerated during an emergency. Similar criticisms for carnivores. Raising meat for snakes or cattle for lions would be too burdensome. Well, dried meat would be a viable substitute. Only 6% of ark volume could have been enough. And it's a misnomer that snakes and other animals have to eat live food. They will eat dead food. Similar arguments can be made for other specialized diets. Some fruit could be dried for frutivores and sugar water for hummingbirds. Pandas, sloths, koalas, primates with specialized diets have all subsisted on non-specialized diets for periods and also dried versions of their diets. Admittedly, some individuals are picky, but again, this goes back to the hardiness selection issue. Okay? Perhaps one of the biggest challenges to diet and habitat might be the question of aquatic animals like seals, walruses, and seabirds that live on a fresh fish diet. Honestly, I'm not sure on that. Okay? But generally speaking, not every animal had to be on their own separate lunch packed for a year and 10 days. Okay? Bamboo here, eucalyptus here, every type of fruit. One could speculate ark animals, being closer to the original animals before the curse, when all animals were herbivores, even though they had been corrupted, were likely more tolerant to a plant-based diet. I mean, after all, if man's diet changed during the flood, when we were allowed to eat meat, then why is it not reasonable to also expect animals also had changes of diet after the flood? The food-water calculations also don't take into account hibernation or torpor. Animal dormancy would be hard to quantify, but would further reduce food and labor requirements. It doesn't have to be winter for hibernation. Shorter and lighter bouts of torpor, days or weeks at a time, could still happen, and regularly do at warmer temperatures. Animals have been documented to hibernate on ships, so wave movement is not an issue. Again, this goes back to the issue of suitability and hardiness and the bare minimum qualities versus specialized evolution after. Experiments have selectively bred hamsters that hibernate. Other non-hibernating animals can still fast for days. As a sidebar, it's interesting to note that two of the most poorly understood aspects of animal behavior, even today in modern biology and zoology, are migration and hibernation. And both of these could easily have been used by God and Noah and in the Noah story. Migration to the ark and hibernation on the ark. Not only do these factors, non-specialized diet, hibernation, etc., make the food volume debate more viable, but it also reduces manpower efforts. So could 8 people take care of all the animals? Again, modern zoo rates don't apply in an emergency. Modern farms are overly automated and thus probably an overestimate. Perhaps maybe a lab setting is better, where one person can take care of as many as 6,000 rodents, 3,800 pigs, one person as many as 5,000 cattle, or 30,000 hens. So one person per 2,000 animals would be a compromised conservative number. Okay? 8 people on the ark times 2 equals 16,000. Okay? Even if Noah's family was only armed with a shovel and a bucket, it is estimated that you could still do 842 pigs per person, 1,000 guinea pigs, or 2,000 birds or more. But efficiency would also largely matter on the side. If food was stored above cages so it just dropped down, you could feed cows in about 17 seconds. If you have self-feeding troughs like bird feeders, you don't even have to do that per day. You could also use animals to assist, like oxen help pulling the cart. On the issue of waste, animal waste would largely be determined by the largest animals. Note that the amount of waste can vary significantly according to diet, okay? But it's been estimated that 12 tons of waste per day. Now that seems like a lot, but is comparable to the daily output of a large poultry factory. A major criticism is the manpower needed to clean it, but poultry and other bird waste can dry and accumulate without odor for years. Slope floors and gravity-fed trenches or slatted floors and traps could be used. In these cases, confining the animals actually helps work the waste through the slatted floor. Such technology was being used as early as the Bronze Age. With adequate bedding, other stables don't need to be cleaned for 6 months to a year. Or you can make the pen so restrictive that the animals can't turn around. So you have bedding up front, but the gutters in the back. Additionally, vericomposting, earthworms and beetles could easily be used and drastically reduce waste volume. And then you could feed those to other animals, like the insectivores. Other maintenance issues or objections: hoof, beak, claw, horn problems. All are minor and not likely life-threatening for only a year. Only a few animals actually need baths on a regular basis, and those could probably be wiped down. Burrowing animals really don't need to burrow. Right? Another somewhat sarcastic objection is that all parasites and diseases had to be carried on the ark, thereby killing off all the passengers. So the critics will take things to the literal extreme and say that all microbes that were created had to be on the ark also. First, the ark says that only those things with breath in their nostrils. Okay? So besides this, parasite spread is only a problem when they come into contact with other animals, and there would be no movement on the ark. Poultry farms realize that small individual cages eliminate parasite spread. Other pests like flies and rodents could be eaten. In the case of microbes often have a beneficial function in one environment, but a negative one when relocated. So this displacement theory may help us better understand the origin and function of pathogenic microbes pre-flood and then their evolution as germs post-flood. Okay? Of course, we all heard that COVID might have come from bats and things like that. So diseases jump species, right, quite often, right? So not every disease for every species need to be present on the ark. Further, spores carrying outside could have carried disease to be picked up later as well. So we see the food, maintenance, health, and the animals is manageable in terms of volume and work required. Now, admittedly, the voyage wouldn't have been a Carnival cruise. For example, it would smell. Another objection is the smell would have been intolerable and the buildup of gases would have been potentially toxic or blow up the ark. But studies show, and yes, these have been done, that odor doesn't continue to incrementally get worse after a short time. Things can only smell so bad. Okay? After that, you really can't tell a difference. And humans can get used to the smell of ammonia in a matter of days. These criticisms are mostly modern sensibilities at work. Now let's keep in mind, platform shoes were developed to keep our feet out of the sewage and the filth in medieval streets. Recall that Versailles was as famous for its stench as much as its splendor. Okay? In ancient times, humans lived with their livestock. Methane gas would not be produced in dry animal waste. And remember our discussion of food, most of it was dried. And even if it did, it would only be a problem if there was a lack of ventilation. Now, the ark had to be ventilated enough that the animals didn't suffocate, so this is a non-issue. So let's talk about the ventilation. Not only is toxic gas buildup a consideration, but it's also the heat. Many claim that the body heat of the animals would make it non-viable, as there wouldn't be enough ventilation. And part of this is built around the concept of, again, that one little skylight on the nursery rhyme portrayals. It suggests that the ark was hermetically sealed. Hebrew scholars affirm the ark is described as having a long row of ventilation slots, exactly like what you see in a large-scale swine or house or other animal houses. Windows at top running the perimeter. The recommended ratio of inlet size per unit of length for sheep is 34.5 centimeters, whereas a biblical cubit would be 45.8. So the vents were larger than what is needed for sheep, and recall the average size of the animals. Few were even sheep size. Also note that only endothermic animals would actually be factored into the problem, right? Warm-blooded animals, which was only a fraction of the animals, which again is a much lower starting number than is often cited by the same critics. Smoke release studies in the 1940s show that airflow inside the ark would occur naturally due to the interaction between the animal's body heat and the outside cooler walls. Studies have also shown that these slot windows are the design that allows for the greatest airflow. And keep in mind, airflow, wind, was probably greater during a worldwide, storm than a summer day in the Midwest. Even taking into account the glancing nature of the wind as the ark aligns as it drifts, Woodmarup calculated air circulation at 5 exchanges per hour, which is comparable to many public buildings today. The animal heat is also used as another greenbelt objection, that the Arctic animals couldn't survive a hotter climate. First, remember that there was one antediluvian continent, and it likely had a mild climate. But for the sake of argument, virtually all Arctic animals can suffer heat stress quickly if it's quickly introduced, but most all can tolerate warmer conditions once acclimated. We've all seen polar bears in like the zoo at June and July swimming around, right? They're not in distress. Okay? Arctic species are likely a post-flood specialization anyway. Heat preferences in iguanas vary by species. The same holds true for arid or desert region species. These animals don't have specialized organs to deal with these environments, only minor adaptations, right, compared to their counterparts in wetter, milder conditions. Camels can thrive in the desert, but that doesn't mean they can't live elsewhere. Okay? So the climate argument is easily overcome by the basic premises of the scientific flood theory. The window design is also a very efficient illumination design, minimizing another argument that Noah would have it be basically in a dark tomb-like structure, impeding care, feeding, etc. Okay? And keep in mind, it is documented that ancient people also used bioluminescence for light. Okay, so there are plenty of creative solutions that Noah could have used to make the feasibility of the ark and overcome a lot of these objections. Okay? Most of the arguments that suggest you have to suspend belief in science to believe in the ark was an actual vessel that really doesn't hold water. Yeah, I went there. Okay, but now that's the only part of the story. This is a worldwide event, so there's a lot more to discuss than just what was going inside the ark. Okay, so we'll pick up next class, and we're going to start talking about what is going on outside of the ark, how the mechanisms of the flood, what was happening to the earth, the geology, and all the evidence, and we'll go from there, what was happening, again, outside the ark. But thanks for coming tonight, and we'll see you then.